at about 12:45, so I think we'll probably try to wrap this up at 12:30, just so that we can give them a little wiggle room. Without further ado, Mark?
Thank you very much for coming out on this Saturday afternoon or Saturday morning. And I want to thank the ISO and the Green Party of Rochester for putting this together. I assume most of you have a pretty good understanding what the Green Party is at this point. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that. Probably most of you don't have a lot of information about the state controller, because very few voters in New York State have any idea what the state controller does. Now, if I had a half an hour, I'd probably spend about 15 minutes explaining what the state controller is and does, but since we only have 10 minutes or so, I'm going to do a very abbreviated introduction around what the state controller does, and then focus primarily on why I am running for state controller. And that is on the issue of climate change, and particularly to try to get the state to divest from fossil fuels. Just quickly weigh my own background. Well, the state controller is sort of like the bookkeeper for the state. They collect the money that comes in from taxes. They then spend the money, pay the bills based on what the state budget has said, and they also have the authority to audit not only state governments but local governments as to whether or not they are managing both their money properly, but also whether or not they are performing their duties on a various tasks properly. Now, if I was state controller, I would tell you that I've been fighting to ensure proper handling of our public funds for decades. 40 years ago, I started a group called the New York helped start a group called the New York Public Interest Research Group. When I was a law student, I wrote the law that gave taxpayers the right to sue for illegal expenditure of taxpayers' funds. When I was 22 years old, I helped sue the state and Albany County over how they were financing the Empire State Plaza to basically circumvent the rules on bonding of state debt. Still a big issue. I was an elected town board member, initially primarily as a Green Party member. One of the things I can say is I'm probably the only elected official in New York State who can say that I cut taxes every single year that I was in office. And that is because I really hate waste and I hate corruption. And one of the things I did is I required all the city contracts, town contracts, to go out for bid. Long story, it turned out that the county Democratic chair was the unnamed co-insurer on our town insurance contract. Never heard of that before. Unnamed co-insurer? It means that your name's not listed on any documents anywhere, but you get the right to pocket half the funds. So he went to federal prison for 2 years over that. Since the year 2000, about 50 state officials have been sent to prison and been forced to resign over corruption. So corruption's a major issue. So I had another 15 minutes. I tell you all the great things about how we're going to solve corruption, how we're not going to certify budgets that fail to comply with the state orders on how much money we're supposed to give to the schools under court orders, that we should be looking to use the state controller's office to push for things like single-payer health care, which I helped revitalize that movement here in New York State, and also to do audits of local departments of social services like in Monroe County, which I've worked with for many years, who routinely violate the law in terms of how they hand out benefits to low-income people. But that's not why I'm running. So I'm running because climate change is the greatest threat to humanity. And for 28 years, I ran a statewide anti-poverty organization, Under Action Network of New York State. But I felt that we were losing the struggle about climate change, and that I had a skill set that might contribute to working on climate change. So I quit my job, no other job lined up, and I devoted the last 5 years full-time to climate change. I will say after the last, and how we'll go more details about this, after the last gubernatorial election, when I really began to focus on trying to get New York to 100% clean energy by 2030, and stopping all fossil fuel infrastructure in New York State, I realized that there was no way we as advocates could ever win. That there's 1,000 individual decisions that we have to make in New York State on climate change, and we are facing an array of bureaucrats and lobbyists and lawyers that the 20, 30, 40 advocate just cannot front. And so unless we elect somebody like Howie Hawkins as governor, we are not going to get action on climate change. And how many people here think that humanity is doomed in the next century? Okay, so we got to convince the rest of you. To me, so this is the point where people begin to walk out and shut down. Maybe it's time to go to the bathroom. But the New York Times Magazine a month ago devoted their entire edition to the proposition that the planet is doomed. That they argue that 30 years ago there was a moment when we knew that climate change was real, that the politicians were not lined up against climate change, and we could have taken action. Now, there was a lot of controversy about that article. All the controversy was on the issue that 30 years ago there was a possibility we could have done something about climate change. There was no dispute about the proposition that humanity is doomed, which I found kind of startling. So we want to argue the first point, that if you vote green, you are creating the political will to demand action on climate change. I can't say that we can solve climate change, but we can definitely reduce the impact from climate change. But we must do it immediately. And we must do it as a system-wide mobilization across the board, similar to what we did after World War II. How do we immediately halt the use of fossil fuels? How do we build out zero-emission vehicles? How do we do regenerative agriculture to put put carbon back into the soil? There was, what we tried to do after 8 years ago when Howie first ran for governor, we called for a ban on fracking. We were ostracized by the big environmental groups in New York State for being too extreme. How can you possibly call for a ban on fracking? You should only call for a study. You should call for a moratorium. We need to explore the water risk. We said, yes, all that is true, but methane from natural gas is 82 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon is. We do not want natural gas. And yes, I know the Sierra Club is being paid by Bloomberg to promote natural gas, but we said no. They did a study, Mark Jacobson, Cornell, about how we can move to 100% clean energy by 2030. We've introduced legislation to accomplish that. I'm now at 8 minutes. So what am I doing up here? So 5 years ago, I started to work with 350.org. They launched an international campaign to get institutions to divest from fossil fuels. I said I'll work on the New York City and the New York State pension funds because I've had 40 years, 50 years of working with state government. I know how it works. And when we started the campaign, we were focusing on the moral issue. It is morally wrong for anybody to seek to profit from the destruction of the planet, and that New York State should not have somewhere between $6 to $11 billion invested in fossil fuels. So we've been doing this campaign. Somehow we've actually managed to divest from institutions $7 trillion. Blows us away. If we had gotten $500 billion a decade ago or 5 years ago when we started, I think we would have been happy. We've managed to divest $7 trillion. Town of Cooperstown, Ithaca, Syracuse University have divested. Earlier this year, we got New York City to divest. That's the third largest pension plan in the United States. I've been living in New York City up until a couple of years ago, and so I helped coordinate the campaign. I'm on the steering committee of 350 New York City. I'm still on the steering committee, even though I now live in upstate New York. They said, well, you're our man in the state capitol, so we're going to keep you on the steering committee. I've not been able to get the state controller to divest. A report came out yesterday that by a group called Corporate Knights, it's an investment firm up in Canada. We had paid them to do a previous study. This study they decided to do on their own, as far as I'm aware. They found if New York State had divested a decade ago, the New York State pension fund would have an additional $22 billion. So by not divesting, we have lost $22 billion. And one of the people we work with, a gentleman named Tom Zenzillo, my opponent, the incumbent, Tom DiNapoli, actually was appointed by the state legislature because the previous controller, Alan Hevensey, was forced to resign, and Tom was an assembly member. But in any case, Tom Zenzillo was the controller between Hevensey and DiNapoli. And he has put out a report showing that for the last 5 or 6 years, the fossil fuel industry has underperformed everything else in the stock market. And that we need to divest now. I mean, in Paris, the world said we are getting out of fossil fuels. We want them to get out. Now, they're talking 10 years, 15 years, or 30 years, but there is no future for fossil fuels on the planet. And the value of those fossil fuel companies is going to go down and down and down. So we need to divest as quickly as possible. There are 2 things I'm trying to win in this campaign, and I'll wrap up. We have some signs in the back you can put on the window. Got to get 50,000 votes for Howie Hawkins for governor, so we maintain our ballot status line. It makes it easier for us to run candidates. You got, how many did you get last time? 170, 180,000?
184,419.
Okay. At least somebody's keeping track of that. We like to beat that. He'll go into that. The other thing that I wanted to come out of this campaign is to get Tom DiNapoli to divest. I knew it was going to be a problem to get the state assembly to pass legislation requiring him to divest because he was appointed by the assembly and they're going to protect him. But I thought if I could get 50 state legislators to co-sponsor legislation in support of divestment, that would be enough to convince Tom to do it. I've gotten 50 people to co-sponsor the bill. He's gone in the opposite direction. He wants to talk to Exxon, even though Exxon is under investigation by the Attorney General for lying for 30 years. He believes in shareholder advocacy, even though it has failed to have any impact over 50 years. So he won't even meet with us. We meet with his staff all the time. I arrange a call between him and Bill McKibben. He wouldn't even take the call from Bill McKibben. So I said, if you're not going to meet with us, you know what? I'm going to run against you. And the controller is the sole trustee, and so whoever is the controller can just make the decision to divest. So we could go on a whole lot more, but time is short, so I'm going to step down and whoever our next speaker is. Thank you. And we'll come back for questions. I know you're all flying on questions. And Howie, you can come and sit up here.
Want
If
to
you
speak
would.
next?
Sure.
Okay. Howie Hawkins.
Good morning. Good morning. So, we're the last option left on the ballot for progressives and socialists. The working family twisted itself into a pretzel again, endorsed status quo. And, I mean, you gotta judge that party by the results, not the rhetoric. And you gotta understand why they did it. It was not about progressive politics. When they say vote for the working families, vote for Cuomo on the working families line to send them a message, it's a vote for Cuomo. And you get lost in the sauce. As far as Cuomo's concerned, that's my vote. They voted for what I stand for. It was really about getting paid. Anybody here from Metro Justice? Well, they're affiliated with Citizen Action, New York Communities for Change, the old Acorn Group. You get a lot of money from the UFT. UFT told them.
Not anymore.
Huh?
Not anymore.
That Metro Justice doesn't, not affiliated with Citizen Action. Okay. Well, where's everybody from Metro Justice? I mean, if they gonna vote for Cuomo? The point I'm getting at is that decision was made about their staff getting paid. You know, there's hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line. And UFT told them, United Federation of Teachers in New York, and I said statewide, said, you don't endorse Cuomo, you don't get your money next year. That's what that's about, transactional politics. They can talk all the rhetoric they want, but when it comes to the general election, they're supporting Andrew Cuomo, conservative corporate Democrat, who does a little talking left, but he governs to the right. Like the minimum wage. He's running around the state saying there's a $15 minimum wage. Up here it's $10.40. It'll get to $12.50 by 2021. He's gonna think about it. He says, yeah, I'm for single payer, but they gotta do it at the federal level. Under Trump, are you kidding me? And then the climate action. He says, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I got this guy Kaufman from Goldman Sachs figuring out how to, game the market so we get some renewables, not being very successful at that. And then even the challenger that the Working Families put up, Cynthia Nixon, was backing a bill called the Climate and Community Protection Act, which is really about codifying Cuomo's policy with a few little tweaks. Like Cuomo wants 80% greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 when it's way too late, and this bill says 100%. But on things like the intermediate goals, 50% clean electricity by 2030. All right, the carbon footprint of electricity in the state is 28%. Bill doesn't deal with transportation, buildings, or agriculture. Okay, so suppose they reach that goal. The bill doesn't stop frac gas infrastructure. So that competitive power ventures plant built with bribes to the brother from another mother of Cuomo, Joe Percoco, that would add 10% back in. So in 2030, a net reduction of 4%. Are you kidding me? And that's what Cynthia Nixon is pestering Cuomo to get behind. And I'm sure Cuomo's thinking, yeah, go ahead, The Assembly passed it 3 times. That bill only goes as far as the Democrats are willing to go. The bill that Mark mentioned, the New York Off-Fossil Fuels Bill, which puts into legislation what we've been calling about in 2010 and 2014, 100% clean energy by 2030. The Jacobson study says it's technically and economically feasible. Mark helped draft the legislation. I think the 5% we got in 2014 meant the legislature said, we better talk to these people. In fact, Cuomo had the DEC director talking to our leadership about energy policy. Maybe just to sound us out, didn't result in any policy changes, but you see, if we get a big vote, we got some leverage in the political system. Now, the bill for New York off-fossil fuels has benchmarks, real benchmarks, like no new construction that's not net carbon zero by 2020. No vehicles sold in the state that are not zero emission vehicles by 2025. Every county and every municipality over 50,000 have to have a climate action plan integrated into the state plan. It bans fossil fuels, frac gas and other. It says no new infrastructure. It says we're not going to subsidize nuclear power. We're going to phase it out as renewables are phased in. I mean, this bill is a serious bill. And I'm asking people to get behind this like we got behind the fracking ban. We got to focus on that. And we got to get the movement, which, people got to get realistic. 350.org action, the PAC associated with 350.org, did not send me a questionnaire. Mark got a hold of one and I sent it to them. They didn't even acknowledge it. And their leader, Bill McKibben, backed Nixon, who's backing this nonsense bill. The bill actually says in it, 450 parts per million, carbon equivalents in the atmosphere is the goal that we're going for with this bill to make New York's contribution to that. That is what the 2007 fourth assessment put out by the International Panel on Climate Change said would give us 50% chance of staying below the 2 degrees Celsius rise that was seen as a tipping point. The science has moved way beyond that. The International Panel on Climate Change, very conservative. They got to get countries like Saudi Arabia to sign off on it before it's released, not to mention the United States. So, that's where McKibben came up with 350.org, 350 parts per million. And so, you see what I'm saying? This bill that the movement thinks, oh, we'll get a little victory, and no, it's too late. This is a climate emergency. The International Panel on Climate Change models do not account for the retreat of Arctic ice. And as the ice retreats, the albedo effect, the reflection of the energy back into the universe, is now absorbed because the ocean is dark. That's one of those positive feedback loops, those tipping points that we're worried about. That's already happening. And because it's happening, we now have methane plumes coming out of the Arctic Sea shelves, particularly off East Siberia, but off Alaska and Greenland. And then the tundra is melting. And the methane is coming up out of there as well as carbon as that permafrost begins to decompose. This is serious. Even the UN says we're going to have 2 billion environmental refugees by 2050. So, we got a serious thing. The carbon in the atmosphere reached 412 at Mauna Loa last spring. So not only, been talking a lot and got a little cold. So not only do we have to stop releasing these greenhouse gases, we've got to start bringing it back down into the biosphere through restorative agriculture to rebuild soils, which now are basically in chemicalized agriculture. They just hold the plants. You have soil ecosystems that can draw in a lot of carbon, as well as reforestation in many places around the planet. So that's one example. The politicians we got in there, Cuomo and all the rest of them, they can't solve simple problems. Like, how about one day for primaries in the state? We got a presidential primary in April, a federal primary in June, and a state local primary in September. And voters are confused. They think, oh, I voted. No, there's another primary. No, I voted in the primary in June. Well, there's state law, you know, so everybody agrees we should do that. These people can't even do that. Lead poisoning. I mean, we are permanently disabling children in large numbers in cities like Rochester. You're in the 20% of the children with above the federal level, which is of safety standard, which is probably too high because there's really no safe level of 5 micrograms per deciliter in the blood. And you're in the 20%, I think one of the zip codes is 17%, one I think gets up to 27%. You're doing a lot better than my city, which has the highest lead levels in the country. We're over 40%. Buffalo's right behind us, 40%. It's a zip code in Utica, 38%. We are permanently disabling children. The lead damages their neurological development, their motor skills, their cognitive capacities, their emotions and behaviors, and this is for life. We're disabling children. It's 47 years since the Surgeon General issued an urgent warning that we have to test the kids, treat those poison, and remediate the source. And it's not rocket science to remediate the source. It's mainly lead paint, the dust. You gotta remove it, paint over it, contain it. Not hard to do, but you know, we've had our public austerity, so our cities don't have the resources to do it. My city doesn't have enough building inspectors to inspect all the apartments in a 3-year cycle. And none of them are trained for lead. This is neglecting the needs of the people, because what are the politicians doing? They're taking big campaign contributions and giving favors to their donors. And that's not even enough. We got mass corruption at the top. The Buffalo Billions, you know, core development, you know, they bid rigged to get that thing. They wrote a bid just so one company could do it. Core and Simonelli out in Buffalo, you know, they bribed Prococo to get that competitive power ventures plan through. The Speaker of the Assembly and the leader of the Senate are going to jail for bribery and other public corruption. Cuomo's now caught up in the straw donors thing with Crystal Run, a health insurance company that got a whole lot of money after these donations went, and it was staff on Crystal Run that gave the donations, the company reimbursed them. That's totally corrupt and illegal. We have mass corruption at the top, and then we got mass incarceration at the bottom. Mm-hmm. Y'all know about Khalif Browder, right? Mm-hmm. You know, he was accused of stealing a backpack, and he said, I didn't do it, so he couldn't make bail. He was locked up in Rikers, and because he wasn't copping to a plea, they treated him harshly. The guards beat him. They let the gangs beat him. They put him in solitary confinement for 2 of the 3 years he was in there. And he came out damaged, traumatized. He took his own life 2 years after his release. And that's just because he couldn't make bail. And Cuomo said he had Khalif's brother, Akeem, at the state address and said, Akeem, we're going to get this done this year. It didn't get done. Mm-hmm. Akeem ran for mayor of New York City as a Green to try to help all the other, you know, nearly 10,000 other Khalifs in Rikers. So if you're poor and you're accused, you go to jail right now because you can't make bail. Whereas Sheldon Silver, the Speaker of the Assembly, Dean Skelos, the leader of the Senate, these, you know, developers and people like Joe Prococo that were involved in the bribes and bid rigging, they're out of jail. I mean, Sheldon Silver's been convicted twice. He's making an appeal now. He never has gone to jail, even though he's been sentenced to something like 8 to 12. I think 12 years the first time, 8 years the second time. So we got to make a difference. There was 600,000 votes for Jumaane Williams, 500,000 votes for Cynthia Nixon. We should get those votes. Mm-hmm. And we should get the votes of those liberals that voted for Cuomo. I think most of them because they're Democrats, they hate Trump, they're voting defensively, and they know Cuomo's name. If they know what we're talking about, they're gonna like what we're talking about. And so we gotta go for those votes too. We got 184,000 votes. We leaped over working families and independents to get 4th on the ballot line. Conservatives are certainly within our sight. They only got 250,000 votes last time. They're between 250 and 350,000 depending on the cycle and the turnout. So the potential is there to at least be third. And, you know, that would be justice, because we got 8 ballot lines with only 3 parties. We got the Democrats, Republicans, and the Greens, whose own candidates created the Democrat, Republican, and Green ballot lines. But all the other ballot lines, working families, women's equality, independence, reform, and conservative, they all were created by a major party candidate. So they added the votes. They need 50,000 votes in their line. They're not parties. They are basically political clubs within the major parties that happen to have a ballot line. So we had the potential to make a really big difference. Historically, our 5% last time was only surpassed by a third party on the left in this state, by the Socialists in 1918, 1920, they got 5.6, 5.7%. And our third party history goes back to the Working Men's Party, 1830. First workers' party in the world. They actually elected the head of the Carpenters Union in New York City to the State Assembly. And then we had the Liberty Party. You know, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, and those guys raising the issue of slavery. And then the populist movement, Greenback Labor, People's Party, and then they brought the money question to the fore during that period, the Gilded Age. Socialists brought social insurance, which the New Deal adopted. Third parties have been enormously influential. And through that whole time, only 2 races were there more. The Socialists were the anti-war party after World War I, and they, you know, got their people, got 5.6, 5.7. They also elected 5 members to the Assembly. The Assembly wouldn't let them in. And so they had a special election. The people elected the Socialists again. They still weren't seated. And then the Assembly and the Senate did this 5,000-word document to justify what they had done about subversive movements around the world. It's a really interesting document. You can read about revolutionaries in Sri Lanka, Serbia, you know, everywhere. When they get to New York State, it says, this is not a party. They're talking about the Socialist Party. This is an organization. And what they meant by a party is you register with the state, and then that tells you which primary you can vote in. But God forbid the working class gets organized. The Socialists, you had to belong to the local branch, pay dues, and agree to the principles. That's what we've got to build if we're serious. Nobody's going to fund us but us. And if we want to change things, we got to get organized and do it ourselves. It's not going to be funded any more than it's going to be televised. The revolution's got to be done by getting ourselves organized and taking concerted action and not taking no for an answer. So how am I doing on time?
About 5 minutes left.
Okay.
15.
Wow, you gotta go overtime.
But we can go to the next speaker if you want.
I was gonna suggest that, and then we could deal with issues and strategy and organization and those kind of things with question and answer.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Joe, would you like to speak next? Sure.
Well, maybe Ream in there and we'll have Jill finish up.
Okay, so our next speaker will be.
But Jill can come up here and take a seat if you want.
Ream Kidane.
I'm going to be very brief. Just wanted to expand our discussion a little bit, perhaps give some context for maybe later questions about the broader political period that we're in. So my name is Ream. I'm a socialist, member of the International Socialist Organization. I was recruited right here at RIT when I came to the epiphany that I am a socialist. About a year later, I went to my first demonstration in Washington, D.C., and began organizing with the International Socialist Organization. And one of the first political activities that I engaged in was actually on the Nader campaign in 2004. And realized what kind of barriers exist for building the kind of third party that we need, or independent party politics. Because our biggest critics weren't Republicans or conservatives, it was Democrats. It was the Democrats that were out there fighting every day, saying that we were ruining the election and so on. So that I worked on the Nader campaign, learned the various ways in which the Democratic Party is the, as I've heard it said, the graveyard of social movements. I say that because I think the political climate has shifted significantly, and I think when we take it all together, that the kind of shifts in consciousness that have happened, as you may well know, the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, has increased its membership by multiples. That is not, it's not simply the consequence of the Bernie Sanders campaign, although that was a major contribution. It was a sense of being fed up with the absolute disgusting character of the political climate, which is consequently also what's fueling what also fueled Trump's campaign, right? And I think that the nature of that shift in consciousness is very diffuse right now. So we have multiple social movements that are feeding the sort of sense of confidence of people. Just a couple days ago, the biggest walkout that I've ever seen at RIT's campus, over 200 students here on campus walked out against the Kavanaugh nomination. And that was on a virtually 24 to 48 hours notice. The Tinder is there. The Tinder for the sort of spark is there. I mean, this is, having been an RIT student, I realize how significant that is, organized by just a few students. But I also want to point out the kind of the sort of pitfalls that may lay before us, and one of them, I heard a characterization of the anti-war movement, which I was a part of during the Iraq War and Afghanistan. It was more of an anti-Bush movement than it was an anti-war movement in a lot of ways. So when Obama came to power, the movement sort of diffused. And I think we face that same challenge now, which is, we have the so-called hashtag resistance leading the sort of like in the public spotlight as being this anti-Trump resistance. But what Howie is pointing out, that Jill has pointed out during her campaign, was actually they have a lot more in common than they have differences, right? And they have no real solutions to the actual crisis that never ended for millions of people in this country after 2008. The stock market is booming, the profits are up, but for the vast majority of people in this country, it's still in the dead center of an economic recession. And so we need to turn this anti-Trump sentiment into a real independent politics, and the opportunity has never been greater. So I think pointing out that, I think we have to claim our victories as well. There's, just recently read that the cop that shot Laquan McDonald in Chicago, the first time in decades that a cop has been held accountable, was found guilty of murder. And to say anything that's not a direct result of the Black Lives Matter campaign, I think would be missing the point. These movements are having impact. The Me Too campaign that has brought out millions of men and women that brought out that galvanized the country against the Kavanaugh nomination, even though it seems like it's going to go through anyway. These movements aren't going away. So claiming our victories and learning from our defeats, I think, is the task ahead of us. But also, but maybe we can take this up in discussion, is what we see as the role of electoral politics in this whole process. The Democrats would have you believe that the elections are the be-all and end-all of our social movements, and I think that would be a mistake. But also, sort of addressing our weaknesses in broader and on the independent left. And that's, I think, on the questions of foreign policy and the questions of economic nationalism that particularly Bernie Sanders and so on, but also addressing these questions and really and having sincere debates. So just lastly, I think the opening for independent politics is greater than ever, but it's not inevitable. And the task is in our hands to actually to galvanize that into a real independent political force in this country. Millions of people are waiting for an alternative. Thank you.
All right. Next, we will have Jill Stein, 2016 Green Party candidate for president.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here with people who will not be silenced, with people who refuse to be good little boys and girls, and just take our marching orders from the powers that are throwing us all over the cliff right now. And I'm on this little road trip, and I went on this little road trip to help candidates, but I feel like I'm helping. This is a therapeutic trip, just to see that we are alive and well, we are strong. There is radio silence out there right now about political opposition. In fact, we're all being demonized. We are the source of all things bad, including Donald Trump. There's radio silence about this incredible churn going out there right now. But there is a huge political vacuum, and I agree completely with what Ream was just saying, that this is a moment of great, incredible potential. And what Howie was saying is that we don't have to look around to find, a place to get organized and a place to put our energy. And also piggybacking off of Ream, there's no better place for building social movements than in political campaigns, because you can sometimes break into the dialogue and be heard by lots of other people. And it's a great time to build the movement and to build the politics, and they have to go together. In the words of Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. Never has, never will. We have to bring that demand everywhere, in our public schools, in our public housing, fighting pipelines, fighting deportations. We've got to be out there, and we are, but we also have to translate that into a political challenge. And there's a whole variety of ways that we win, and Howie was pointing out, in some of the history of, social insurance and the 40-hour work week and so on, and women's right to vote. These social movements translate, but they always have political parties that bring those demands into political discourse. So what we're doing is exactly what we need to be doing. And I want to underscore how much potential there is right now. There is this deafening political silence for real progressive politics, for radical progressive politics. 100 million people, 100 million eligible voters did not vote in 2016. That's about twice the number of those who voted for either Clinton or Trump. So that's a huge reservoir. And people who want to blame the outcome of the election on third parties or Bernie Sanders or our campaign, it's nothing but political intimidation and part of this era of McCarthyism that we're in right now. And I think it's really important, to stand up against that kind of political bullying and to say that, I'm not telling you how to vote, you don't tell anyone else how to vote, and politicians do not own our votes, they have to earn our votes. And in fact, there are 100 million people out there who are looking for something to vote for, and the two major parties being stuffed down our throats by every political message and every conventional message that you can possibly imagine many times a day. The stuff people are being informed about is the stuff that is throwing working people under the bus. So we need to be heard. This is a time for more voices and more choices, not fewer. And to those who say the problem is that we offered people something meaningful, they need to know that we were bringing people out from that 100 million. Exit polls from the presidential race show that the majority of Green voters would not have voted. The vast majority, over 60%, would not have voted had they not had a Green to vote for. And in the absence of our campaign, 1/3 of our voters would have voted for Donald Trump. So you can't just move Green votes into the Democratic column and say that those votes belong to Hillary. They didn't. They wouldn't have gone to her. And the same is true for Gary Johnson's votes. If you're going to donate our votes to Hillary, you have to donate Johnson votes to Trump, in which case Trump wins by an even bigger margin. So the people who are trying to blame us and shame us, that is their objective. There's no logic to it. There's nothing in the service of democracy about it. The solutions for a democracy on life support are not political silence. It's not less democracy. Democracy depends on vigorous debate and opposition parties, and I think it's a sign of great achievement that we as Greens have become sort of the scapegoats, the face of political opposition on which so much is being blamed right now. I sort of perversely enjoy this because it feels like, wow, we've come such a long way. As Gandhi pointed out, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And there's no doubt we are in this moment right now where the empire is it's doubling down in desperation because its days are numbered. As Chris Hedges often points out, we're like the Roman Empire. We're poisoning ourselves and the rest of the world. And we're spending ourselves into bankruptcy. It's practically 60% of our national budget now controlled by Congress. 60% which is being spent on these wars, endless war. In Afghanistan, we just came to the 17th anniversary of the war in Afghanistan. We spent almost $1 trillion. It comes to something like $23,000 per taxpayer that we've spent on the whole war budget since 9/11, since 2001. In Afghanistan, the biggest danger to U.S. soldiers is not the Taliban. In fact, the Taliban are doing better and better. They have more territory than they did 10 years ago, so it's not like we're making progress, even measured in terms of territorial control. The biggest threat to U.S. and NATO soldiers is actually, I should say to U.S. soldiers, is suicide. And that tells you how much meaning there is in this madness. The second biggest threat is the Afghan soldiers that they are training, which tells you how much we are serving the cause of democracy here. And what's been the outcome of all of this? Practically $1 trillion in Afghanistan alone, over $5 trillion in the whole war on terror, which is an endless war. And according to their own reports, their own guidance documents being written by the Department of Defense, and in particular by the Special Operations Forces, they are now on the global battlefield with essentially a preemptive strike ready to go. So war is no longer something that you mobilize for after something happens. You're ready everywhere. It's a global battlefield. This stuff is just insane. We have 800 military bases. 800? If you add up Russia and China and all our adversaries and all our allies, how many foreign bases does everybody else have? It's somewhere around 30 in total, and we have 800. So what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this picture is that this is an empire teetering at the brink, spending itself into its own destruction, imposing austerity at home as the companion of endless war abroad, with a global meltdown of human rights, social justice, economic sovereignty. We have a foreign policy based on military and economic domination, essentially. That's very expensive. It also doesn't work, and it is spending itself into oblivion right now, while it puts all of us at risk. 2,000 missiles, nuclear warheads, I should say, on hair trigger alert between us and Russia. Russia didn't move west. Did it expand its borders west? No, there is a civil war going on in Ukraine, that's true. It's going to take all of us to stop it, and that's what the Minsk Accords actually are about, which we refuse to participate in, by the way. So there are some issues, and we all, it's going to take all of us to untangle those issues. But fundamentally, Russia has not been expanding west, but NATO has moved up to Russia's borders, which it sees as the reason why it's been aggressive at its borders. So there have been two to tango here for quite a while, and for decades we have been encroaching on territory that we promised when Germany was reunified and joined NATO. We promised the Soviet Union at that time and Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east of Germany if Germany was allowed to reunify, because you may remember Russia was invaded and lost some, what was the number? 50 million, just, huge numbers of people were killed. So Russia's touchy about its border. We were touchy about our borders when we had Russian missiles in Cuba. So we've now got the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse on steroids, and it needs a little bit of calming down. In the words of John Kennedy, we must not negotiate out of fear, and we mustn't fear to negotiate. We gotta do that, we gotta talk to each other. And that's what I was doing in Russia, by the way, for those who are trying to make a conspiracy out of it. That's what was going on here. My address, my remarks at a conference are actually on YouTube. If you want to see actually what I said, you can see there was nothing about the election and nothing about soliciting support from Russia or anybody else. But this is it's a bad joke that we have really critical issues to be talking about here, like climate change, which was also part of my mission, which included at that point not only Moscow but also the climate conference in Paris, where I was able to talk to foreign leaders. I wasn't able to talk to Putin, but I did talk to a number of foreign leaders, including Jeremy Corbyn, and also the deputy climate lead negotiator for China, to just let them know that there are political forces in the US which are not controlled by the war profiteers, by the fossil fuel giants, that there is a spirit of diplomacy and dialogue that used to be our international policy. It's kind of become invisible now, and the Democrats are leading the charge in this era of warmongering as much as the Republicans. It's hard to say who's the worst warmonger now, and both of them came together to pass the biggest military budget in history. And in fact, the Democrats are so frightened about Donald Trump's, craziness that they had to give him more money, $60 billion more for the military budget than even he asked for. So we're in a political establishment right now which is self-destructing us all, but the American people are in revolt. That revolt is actually happening right now. It's alive and well. And we're seeing it in these vibrant political campaigns, and I've had the great pleasure of touching down with many of them. In Ohio, they have 75% more registered Greens now than they did in 2016. So, where we have the numbers, we see that there is a spirit of revolt. The Green Party happens to be the one non-corporate politics of integrity that has national scope, that has a tradition of running candidates, getting on the ballot, challenging power. We have been working together with the ISO in Howie's campaigns, for example, in other electoral campaigns, and in fights on the ground, like the system change, not climate change efforts, living wages, and so on. And I think this is the name of the game, to work together on the ground, on these social movements, particularly where they are most seriously needed. Public housing, people who are being threatened with homelessness, a generation of young people locked into debt. The student debt movement is a powerhouse that's just waiting to be ignited. 45 million young people locked into predatory student loans without the jobs to be able to pay them back. This is lifelong indentured servant status, and it's no wonder millennials are not voting and see the system as hopeless. But that's what the system wants you to feel. They want you to feel hopeless, because if you feel hopeless, you'll be powerless. If you don't feel hopeless, you will be powerful. In the words of Alice Walker, the biggest way we give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. We do have the power, we have the numbers, 45 million people locked in student debt. That's practically enough to win an election right there, just on that one constituency. Bring in their parents, and their families who are also encumbered with this debt, and you have a plurality. So we do have the power, which is why John Oliver had to spend an entire episode ridiculing our campaign for supporting a student bailout and saying, ha ha ha, that's so ridiculous. But in fact, they had to say that because it's so powerful. Now Bernie Sanders has taken up our call, and they've also followed in our footsteps in calling for free public higher education, which we've been doing for a long time. I don't know how far back Howie's campaign goes in calling for free public higher ed, but it's a long time.
Before me, Stanley Aronowitz ran on.
Okay? He knows the history. Yeah, so it's a powerful moment. There's a political vacuum. We gotta fill it. This campaign right now with Howie and his running mate, Gia Lee, and Mark Dunlea, and the other local candidates, this is the time to stand up. If you're worried about splitting the vote, remember, there's a solution here. And besides, as our numbers demonstrated, we're splitting the non-vote. We're taking away from the non-voters. We're not taking away from others. We are going strong. We need to stand up loud and strong. And we have the numbers. We have the moral authority. There is no other way out of this mess. The clock is ticking on climate change, on nuclear confrontation, on economic collapse, on human rights for the disabled, for the poor, for black and brown communities, and all of us are in the process. If you're not disabled now, you will be. Half of Americans currently have at least one chronic illness and disease. We are getting sicker, we're not getting better, and we're spending more and more money to only get sicker as we are made ill. We are made sick by air pollution, which kills 8 million people a year, premature deaths, by economic stress, by violence of our economy in our communities. Poverty is violent and kills people. According to School of Public Health at University of Columbia, it's like 500,000 people a year in the US are dying from poverty and its sequela. We are all at risk by the incredible empire that's unraveling before our eyes right now. So it's gonna fall on us unless we stand up and push our way out of this. And the more organized we are, and the sooner we're organized, the less harm there will be as the empire collapses, which it is doing and it inevitably will continue to do. So whether you're looking at the climate or the next impending economic meltdown, the social chaos around us, we're all in the target hairs right now. So we say, forget the lesser evil, fight for the greater good, like your life depends on it, because it does. And in fact, at the end of the day, we do have the power to turn this around, to create an America and a world that works for all of us, starting right here, right now, in this campaign. Get behind Howie's campaign. If you haven't already, start phone banking, flyer your neighborhood. There were some folks who turned out in Ohio, in Detroit, where we just were, that, some vegans who got all inspired and said they're gonna take the flyers for their gubernatorial candidate to the next vegan festival because they think vegans are tuned out and have incredible potential to mobilize. So many of us are part of networks right now that could be mobilized. If anybody's on a campus, the student debt issue is just, it's dynamite for getting people out. And for people to understand, we can fix this. If you got a problem with a split vote, remember, it's not really split, but if you're worried about it, pass ranked choice voting, which the state of Maine just passed. It enables you to rank your choices. So if your first choice loses, your vote's automatically reassigned to your second choice. That's a little bit simplified, but that's the basics of what's going on. So there's never a wasted vote. You don't throw your vote away. We can have that anytime we stand up and demand it. In the state of Maine, they just passed it. Guess who tried to repeal it? The legislature. So the people brought it back as a people's veto to veto the legislature's roadblock, and they won again, and they just had an election using ranked choice voting, and guess what it did? It brought out more people than ever to their election. We need more voices and more choices to lift us up so we can harness this latent revolt that is alive and well out there in the grassroots. It needs a political home to give it a voice and to give it a framework and to give it a game plan. We gotta work together, and we gotta work together for the long haul. That's how we get to critical mass, and we take back our future, and we demand more, a just, sustainable, green future, and a healthy and small d democratic future, which is within our reach. Let's make it happen, get involved in this campaign, and let's show them what democracy looks like. Thank you.
So Jill said that we can go until like 12:40, which gives us about 20 minutes. I do have an extra microphone for the panelists if you want it. I think just to try and get as many people to talk as possible, I'll maybe try to keep people to about 2 minutes, comments or questions, and I'll take a couple at a time, and then maybe we can head back to the panel at the end, just for their final comments. So if you want to speak, raise your hand. I will write that down, and feel free to raise your hand while someone else is speaking. Kevin, are you up front?
All set?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, thank you so much for your time and patience in coming today. Appreciate hearing your wonderful stories. This is a really rare opportunity to get exposure to folks like you with access through sign language. So I was hoping I could teach just a few signs to you and the people here today. When you take them home, you could use them in your campaign. This is the sign for vote. Please copy me and actually produce the sign. Vote. That's the sign for vote. I vote, just index finger, point at yourself, I vote. And all of you vote. So that'll be easy to remember, vote. And Green Party, for revolt, they tend to sign revolt. That's revolt. And this is a revolt. I revolt. There you got it. And now either for excitement here, we can say it's enough. Just enough. I've had enough. It's enough. And in the deaf community, isn't well known for diplomacy. Very, very direct. But this will be clear to anyone who sees it. Just that sign is one of the many variants for bullshit. Bullshit. So those are 4 signs. I hope you actually remember them. Use them in your campaign if you want. You get people's attention.
Yeah.
30 seconds.
I have one more comment.
One more quick comment if I have 30 seconds. RIT's famous for sustainability. We're well known. We have an Institute of Sustainability on campus. That's my personal interest. And there's something, a hempcrete. Hempcrete?
How about that?
I just want to tell Howie about that, because we need to get hemp legal in this state. You've got concrete, well, you can have
Two different issues.
hempcrete.
Hempcrete.
Hempcrete is carbon negative for construction. Not even, it sequesters and absorbs carbon. They can make it in Colorado, but you can make it from the hemp plant and use it in construction in place of concrete, and we need to make that policy permanent. We can stop using concrete and use a substitute that's carbon negative, actually absorbs and sequesters it.
Look it up.
So, hope you look into that, find out about it.
Yeah, where can we find out about it?
Hempcrete, look it online.
If you just look online for hempcrete,
Okay.
and also it's used in Colorado. I mean, Colorado's actually passed a bill to allow it in the system to use hempcrete in construction. And they're not using the term sustainability, they're using regenerative. Sustainability is actually becoming an archaic term. Because of climate change, they're using the term regenerative. And we need to provide opportunities for economic growth, for CPD policies, and establishing those standards for CBD policies. And possibly legal. I'm not talking about that. Marijuana should be legal.
That's racism.
That's, I think
Talk about
there's
CBD.
racism
That's the
in
medical term in
marijuana,
Colorado.
but
CBD or
CBD is the term they're using instead of marijuana. CBD, you can talk about oils or edibles or CBD.
Two completely
And
separate issues.
hempcrete are two
You look at the
completely
history of the
separate
racism back in Prohibition era.
issues, and we need
Now
to get rid of that racism from back in
Hemp
the
industry, medicine.
industrial area that got
And
just
so I'm giving you the idea, you need to
institutionalized.
use CBD, hemp,
So,
hemp
we use the term
hemp vote.
CBD, hemp,
And
hempcrete, and vote.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Up front in the blue shirt,
Okay.
followed by our city in the black shirt.
Okay, I'll introduce myself first. My name is Mike Gamms, and I work a lot recently with at the United Nations level with an organization called the International Native Tradition Interchange, which is an international indigenous peoples organization. And we're talking about different terminology and the phrase climate change. Well, some of the leaders that I've worked with on an international level actually say there is no climate change. There's only destruction of the planet by transnational corporations and governments. And I kind of tend to agree with that, and that terminology is super important, and we need to call it exactly what it is. And I know that everyone on this panel is pretty on board with being very direct about what exactly is happening. And I think that in terms of terminology, trying to use the phrase climate change less and destruction of the planet by transnational corporations and governments is exactly what it is. It's not that the climate's changing, it's that the planet is being destroyed, period. So, just wanted to say that. And then also, I have some things I'd like to say to Howie. I listened to an interview you did recently with Anders Lee on Poddamn America, a radio interview. And so for those that don't know, that they come from more of a Democratic Socialists of America background. And you talked a lot about, including in your speech here, reaching out to the Cynthia Nixon voters and the Democratic Socialist voters. And we know that they've had like this huge increase in their movement recently. A lot of it was after Bernie Sanders' campaign, and they seem to be trying to bring socialism and change through the Democratic Party, and we've seen how that has failed time and time again. And y'all seem to be focused on bringing eco-socialism through a third party. And my question is, as a person who, a majority of my friends my age are more in the DSA than the Green Party, how do we bridge that gap and get them to vote Green Party and bring them into what we're doing here, which is actually way more aligned with what they believe in than the Democratic Party's ever going to be? So.
Thank you. How long do you guys want to wrap up at the end? How much time? Because we're at like 12:25 now, so I have a couple more people who want to make comments, and then we'll just head back to the panel. Okay.
Yeah.
Arseny?
I just have two questions.
A little louder, please. For me, I'm hard to hear, if you could speak up or.
Sure, is this better?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I have two questions. One question is, what is the relationship between the Green Party and socialism? If you could talk more about that. You know, how we mentioned the 1917-18 Socialist Party election, so interested in that relationship, socialism and Green Party. And then secondly, what, this is for Howie, what your campaign is doing to reach out to communities of color and to bring them on board specifically.
Thank you. Next, Sean, here.
So, first of all, thanks everyone, this is awesome. I think at the beginning of Mark's talk, he asked how many of us believe that the planet is in doom. And I didn't raise my hand, and you see many of the people now didn't raise their hand, because we think we can change that, right? Because we think we have the ability for the working class to come together, organize ourselves in a way that can stand up and change that so that doesn't happen. And I think that's critical. And I think that underlies everything that we need to be doing when we're out there on the campaign trail. Right now, the political situation is so exciting. And that's derived from the stagnation since the 2008 economic crisis that has pushed so many young people to an understanding of common sense socialism, and that the system is so fucked up that we need to do something different. That's how we reach the people, by speaking to that idea. We are socialists. If you're a socialist running on the Green Party line, you're a socialist, and say that. That's what's gonna get people excited. That's what's gonna get people to come out. And to build on what Marcini just said in his comment, like, that is critical. And every time a socialist, like Howie mentioned, anytime a socialist won 5%, or anybody won 5%, they said they were a socialist, right? And that was what drew people out, right? We have something different to offer. It is different than what anybody running in the Democratic Party is, from the DSA or anybody. We offer a vision that can change the future. And that's working class people organizing ourselves together. And I think we need to do that in an independent party. And that's why we support Green Party candidates, because they are independent. But we need to stand up when we are independent and say we're socialists. That's right now what is driving people, and that's what's gonna excite people.
Excellent, thank you. Unless there's anyone else, I haven't seen any other hands, and it's 12:28, so I wanna give it Howie and Jill enough time to respond before they, okay, go right ahead.
36-hour work week and polygraphed candidates.
I like it. All right, is there someone on the panel that wants to respond first? And I'll just keep you guys updated on what time it is. I don't want Jill to be late.
Why don't you go?
Yeah, I would add to what you were saying about the planet is being destroyed by transnational corporations. Therefore, we need a socialist system that is an economic democracy where we actually have the power to fix the planet, not let these rich folks destroy it. With the DSA, there are a lot of what I call quote-unquote socialist, capital D Democrats. Bernie Sanders is the biggest one, but I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others, they're missing two central tenets of the socialist tradition. One of which is socialization or democratization of the means of production, so that we actually can use the tools that we have to regenerate the planet and have the wealth and value that we create distributed fairly, equitably, based on our labor contribution. Now, half of what we produce is taken by the rich, and then these quote-unquote socialist capital D Democrats want some tax and transfer programs to partially mitigate that. We want it equitably distributed in the first place, according to your effort. That's in the private sector, the public sector. There's some things that should be social goods that everybody gets, whether they can contribute or not. A decent home, a good education, healthcare, access to employment if they are able and willing, or at least an income so they're not living in poverty. These are the things that would have been the fulfillment of the New Deal as FDR articulated them in his last State of the Union address, and then were picked up by the Civil Rights Movement, adding the important thing that these rights should be available without discrimination, because the New Deal was really affirmative action for white people because they excluded domestics and farm workers, which were mainly black and Mexican at that time in this country. And so that's why we call for a Green New Deal. We gotta secure those rights and deal with the climate crisis and the other environmental crises we face. And I believe that's politically necessary to build the majority coalition. Just like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King, those leaders of actually the Socialist Party, a little party. They organized the March on Washington. It was the Yipsels, the Young People's Socialist League, that were the cadre that organized the buses and got the leaflets. And they pulled out that major demonstration, but in their minds was the Black Freedom Movement now had to lead the whole working class to these economic rights, or the white backlash is gonna destroy our civil rights. Same thing today. If we don't tell the people whose communities will lose a nuclear power plant and all their tax base, or the workers that work at a coal plant or a nuclear plant, or in the fossil fuel industry, if we don't say, you're secure, we're gonna provide your income and benefits during the transition, they're gonna be resisting, and we'll be divided, and the corporations, of course, play that up. So that's one tenet, socialization or democratization of the means of production. The other is independent political action. The socialist movement learned this in 1848. You know, the people in Europe and it spread to Latin America were fighting, working people, fighting for the right to vote, as were the rising business class against the aristocracy, the landed aristocracy, the monarchies. And they had revolutions for that, all across Europe. 1848, and then the landed elites told the business people, come over here, let's cut a deal and keep the working people out, and that's what they did. The conclusion of the working class movement, the socialist movement, was we gotta liberate ourselves. We can't rely on these people for allies. Bring it up. We had independent political action from the Working Men's Party right up to the Socialist Party. In 1936, the communists said we need a popular front against fascism. We need to unite with the Democrats against the Nazis. And maybe you could argue that, you know, in some circumstances, but that's been the policy ever since. So the self-described socialists have done the grunt work to elect liberals who then move to the right because there's no left in this country. We have no distinct identity. We are not different if we are capital D Democratic Socialists, because we're back in the Cuomo's. You know, there are a lot of so-called socialists in the Working Families Party say, oh, we gotta vote for Cuomo. So, independent political action. So I think socialists.
We're running short on time.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Socialists need to educate
I cede my time.
TSA people about socialism. And yeah, Greens should be talking about socialism. We have passed a resolution in our national platform saying we're for ecological socialism.
Yeah.
Kind of a clunky resolution in my opinion, but the debate goes on. And the thing about socialism now, I came up in the McCarthy era, it was a conversation stopper, just the word.
Yeah.
Now it's a conversation starter. And I'm really glad the conversation is going on because the capitalists can't defend their system. It's, once we have that debate, we can win.
Okay, I'm gonna grab it. Howie hasn't mentioned this, it costs money to run a political campaign, and we've raised about 25% of what we raised 4 years ago. We are desperate for donations. Was it Hawkins for governor? There are forms in the back. Howie has a new ad that just came out 3 days ago. You can find it on his homepage, but we need people to help promote that. We need people to really follow us on social media and then retweet us. Do not like us on Twitter, and you can like us, I guess, on Facebook. Humanity is doomed on the planet. You know, people, oh, are you getting tired of crying wolves? And we say the wolves are here. The wolves are inside the door. There is no time left. The Arctic was on fire in August. The temperature in the Arctic Circle, which is where you see climate change, has risen from like 30 degrees to 60 degrees. 30 degrees in a period of 5 years. Puerto Rico went without power for 6 months, and people did not have access to water. That was a first world country, even though we treat them as a third world colony. We need socialists to be more aggressive about the issue of public ownership of our energy system. We need to have the public own offshore wind. We need to have the public own solar. The state should be putting solar on every single building now. If Solar City can do it and put it on for free, so should New York. So you can also donate online, howiehawkins.org/donate, and we have 2 minutes.
You can also do cash. You just need to fill out a little form, and it's on the
Under
table in the
100
back.
though.
Yeah, up to 100. Cuomo's average donation was 3,500 4 years ago, ours was 35. And the 35, we had more donors than he did. Not as much money, but, so anything helps, $5, so does 500.
And I'll just say that this is that Hail Mary moment, you know, we are out of time. Consider this the last campaign, you know. Chris Hedges is doing the farewell tour, you know. We need to treat every day like it's the new beginning it should be, you know, and Howie's campaign is that. It's got the guaranteed benefits for workers. It brings together socialists and progressives of all stripes under a clear, aggressive, radical social agenda. Rendering public, taking back into public management, economic democracy, our basic economic institutions as part of the Green New Deal, which puts workers and the planet together. We can't save one without the other. It's a, you know, it's the high ideal that we need, but it's also the nitty-gritty detail, which is just really well worked out. Howie was told by one of his mainstream corporate interviewers that he had the real program. He had incredible detail and knowledge that none of the other candidates had. So this is the best way to actually meet these crises at the same time that we actually build our organization. And we, you know, if those of us stand up who get it, courage is contagious, and we will bring along, you know, the people in the DSA who are asking questions themselves in their own organization after, you know, several turned out at a event we held for Howie on Saturday, and they were saying that, you know, they're asking questions internally now about what good does it do to endorse a Democrat if it just comes back to endorsing the ticket with nothing in return. So this is a big learning moment that we're in right now, and we need to learn really fast, and we who get it need to stand up with the authority, the moral authority of our vision, which is the only way that we can kind of put this back together. We can reclaim the planet, and it's not only regenerative concrete, you know, we can have regenerative agriculture, we can have a regenerative economy. That needs to be the watchword of the day. And I'll just end saying that when we do what's healthy for our economy and the planet, which is what the Green New Deal is, it declares a national emergency, you know, like in the Second World War, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a national emergency was declared. It took us 6 months, all of 6 months, to transform the economy to a wartime footing. Unfortunately, we've never retreated from that wartime footing. But if we could do that in 6 months, we can do by 2030, 100% clean renewable energy, give everyone a good job, a good wage job, and a guarantee of that good wage job, as well as healthcare, education, affordable housing, bring back into public management our essential public utilities, energy and electricity and food and transportation. You know, we can make this in the same way that the capitalists have disaster capitalism. You know, we need disaster socialism, and we need to have that plan out there, whatever we're calling it. That's really what the Green New Deal is. This is the time to mobilize behind it, and this is the campaign that really has the depth of knowledge and the high vision and the grassroots connections. We just need people to start standing up, and others will follow. So let's make it happen. It's in our hands. Write that check. Whatever you got helps, and sign up and get out. Let's be loud and strong, and let's take our future back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Ream, do you want to say anything?
I just wanted to say a few words. I think, you know, the questions of, is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah, just yell.
So the questions of, like, I think the interesting, you know, the interesting question about the DSA and the Green Party, they're two very distinct traditions, come from, you know, very, like, in a lot of ways, very different histories. The first of all, you know, the Green Party is a party, is a political party. The DSA is a membership organization. I had to explain somebody, with a friend of mine who's just getting into politics, and said, how do I register for the DSA? You know, how do I to vote on the party line or whatever? And I was like, well, you don't actually do that. It's just a membership organization. But I think that speaks to a certain kind of, the question about whether or not, so people are considering, the word socialism is no longer sort of a non-starter, as Howie mentioned. However, we do have to reckon with a sort of distorted history of socialism over the past few decades, but also it's not just in the United States that socialism can have a very different sort of conception based on who you're talking to. It's an international question where you have the socialist parties actually, the Social Democratic Party, Socialist parties actually pushing neoliberal policies. But what it does is open up a space in which we have the ability to actually redefine for an entirely new generation what socialism means. The significance of these electoral campaigns and the fact that many DSA members are actually choosing to run on Democratic Party lines is that they are actually setting the tone, and we want to set the opposite tone. Is that we actually want an independent socialist organization, independent socialist politics. So the DSA is a very broad tent organization. There is a left wing, and I think that's what the Green Party's audience is. There's a left wing that is actually looking for the sort of like reorganization of society economically, socially, and more democratically. We can't do that oriented on the Democrats.
Nice.
Awesome, thank you.
So, just to end, I want to thank everyone for being here in the audience and also the speakers. Our interpreter, Erin, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Erin.
I appreciate it very much. Jill, I think you have to take off. I don't know.
Do we have to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're all going to the same event next, though.
Oh, okay, all right, so we'll wait for you.
Well, thank you again.
What's the event?
Syracuse.
In Syracuse, there is an event in Syracuse at what time?
2:30.
2:30. Location, if anyone wants to go.
The location is at the Green Party offices. Do you have the address, Howie?
Yeah, 2617 South Salina Street.
Thank you.
And
Awesome.
it's right off Interstate 81. Go straight, right, turn right, and there it is.
There's books, there's ways to donate out there, buttons, I saw the signs. If you want it, go get it. Thank you.
Thank you.